You can start.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Republic of Work Lunch and Learn series. We're very glad to be here, and we'd like to thank the Republic of Work for giving us the opportunity to speak to such a lovely audience. Um, Republic of Work have a variety of events aimed at upskilling and growing within your business, so be sure to check them out on republicofwork.com. There is also a library of past events available on their website of all the topics already covered, including sales, marketing, accounting, and wellness. Um, I think we'll start with introducing ourselves. My name is Amir, and with me here is my colleague, Aideen. Together, we recently founded our consultancy here in Cork. It's called UX Enhancement Solutions, or UXES. And we specialize in providing user experience research and design services. Our clients are startups and enterprises from different areas, and they hire us to help them optimize the experience for the end users of their products. For this talk, we've been asked to introduce our field and explain a bit about what we do. So we'll go straight to it. And if you have any questions, you're welcome to write them in the chat box, the group chat box, and we'll try to answer everyone at the end. During the talk, we'd appreciate it if you could remain muted. So let's start with the basic question. What is user experience? And it's actually not such a simple question. We could maybe say that more than anything, user experience has become kind of a buzzword, something that everybody's talking about, seems like everybody's got to have it, but probably not everyone who's talking about it is actually talking about the same thing. So in an attempt to find a more educated definition, let's start with taking a look at this screenshot. You've all been in this type of situation once or twice, I assume, and I bet just looking at this caused a few of you some level of stress. Right? It says here, bad credentials, please log in again. First of all, what did we get wrong? Is it the password, or maybe you didn't use the right email? Not clear from the message. Let's assume that the email address is right. In that case, the password must be wrong. Now you need to decide if you can try to remember the right password, or maybe check if you have it written down somewhere, or maybe check your browser's password manager, but that requires another password, and you remember that one. Or maybe just give it up and go straight to the forgot password option, the beloved one down there. But then you need to make sure you remember your grandmother's maiden name or the name of your first pet. Or maybe they do that two-step authentication thing that become popular lately, where you get a code texted to your phone, which is not always ideal either, because maybe your phone is not with you. So many questions and thoughts going through your head while you try to figure this out. And also emotions, surprise, frustration, anticipation, and hopefully at the end, satisfaction. So whatever went through your head while navigating through this simple everyday situation is your experience as a user. So the first and most straightforward answer to our question comes from the origin of UX, a branch of psychology called ergonomics. Ergonomics is the study of human-machine interaction, also called sometimes the human factor. So as a scientific discipline, user experience is the study of the psychology of people who use machines. The ergonomic definition of UX is a person's perceptions and responses that result from the use or anticipated use of a product, system, or service. This definition goes on and specifies further that this experience includes, and I'll read it, all the user's emotions, beliefs, preferences, perceptions, physical and psychological responses, behaviors, and accomplishments that occur before, during, and after the use of a product, system, or service. Now, let's make another definition. All of these psychological responses are a result of the interaction of this person with the product. So a main concern of UX is the points of contact between the person and the product, which is what we call user interface or UI. This is also kind of a tricky term, which is often used interchangeably with UX, but they're not exactly the same thing. It would be more accurate to say that they're complementary terms. We can say that the theory of user experience is the psychology of a person who's using a user interface. So let's see. What does a user interface include, actually? Well, in today's world, when you think of UI, the first thing that comes to mind is graphic UI, GUI, which is essentially everything that goes on the screen. And it's understandable that this is getting most of attention since in our modern world, most of our interaction with machines is indeed done through digital screens, which are constantly designed and redesigned. So that's a main focus of the UX world. But as a matter of fact, graphic UI is far from being the only possible point of contact of a user with a machine. UI can also, for example, be textual. As a matter of fact, almost every graphic interface has, just admit another person. Sorry, need to also admit people. Yeah, so as a matter of fact, almost every graphic interface has some textual elements in it. Um, like labels, dialogues, or error messages, which all have a huge effect on the user's experience. Uh, just think of that ambiguous login error message and how much frustration it can cause. Now, the textual part of an interface is what we call microcopy. And there are actually some interfaces that are based mostly or even purely on text. For example, email newsletters, or a more up-to-date example, chatbots, which are essentially a bulk of text strings and conditions arranged by an algorithm. And that's not all. We should not forget another important element of an interface, which is sound. Actually, there's a common argument that this is a part not getting the attention it deserves in today's business world because the field of UX is dominated mostly by graphic designers who tend to focus on the visual. This might have been justified in the past when sound interfaces were quite limited to some basic, just another, sorry.
Multitasking.
Yeah, sorry. So this might have been justified in the past when sound interfaces were quite limited to some basic audio signals, like the sound of a notification coming into your phone. But this area is now growing rapidly with the rise of voice-operated interfaces, for example, personal or home assistants like Siri and Alexa, or automated helplines, which are essentially chatbots operated by voice. So talking in human language can also be a user interface. And that's not all either. We should not forget the hardware itself, which is also an important point of contact between the user and the machine. In old school products, the hardware of the interface would be made of all kinds of controls, such as buttons, knobs, and levers. The hardware of the basic modern digital interface includes the screen itself, maybe with a few exterior buttons like this iPhone you see here. Um, for a computer screen, you usually also have a keyboard and a mouse to complement it. They're also part of the interface, and gaming consoles have joysticks. All these haven't changed much in the last 30 years, those pieces of hardware, with the only main addition in recent years being the capacitive touchscreen that introduced smartphones and tablets into our life. But this area is also expanding rapidly these days. And in today's world of IoT, Internet of Things, essentially anything connected to a computer or to the web can be an interface. It can be any wearable like a watch, or a smart car, where your interface also includes essentially the car itself and everything in it. And looking into the future, we'll start seeing more and more augmented reality and virtual reality interfaces, a whole new world of interface with new rules, which is a fast growing area. So all of these things together form the user interface. And this interface determines a large portion of your experience as a user. But how do we know an interface is actually providing the required experience? Well, the main metric we use to evaluate an interface is what we call usability. Uh, that's another important term, which is defined as the capacity of a system to provide a condition for its users to perform the task safely, effectively, and efficiently while enjoying the experience. Or to put it in simple words, is the interface what we call user-friendly. Now, there's a whole theory on how to make an interface more usable or user-friendly, and a great portion of it is attributed to one person. Don Norman, considered the father of UX. Norman, an ergonomics professor, didn't actually invent anything. The use of these terms we've defined, like UX, UI, and usability, actually dates back to 19th century ergonomics. But modern UX, as we know it today, was developed a lot later, along with the rise of digital and graphic interfaces in the last 3 decades or so. And its moment of birth was probably the publication in 1988 of this book, The Design of Everyday Things. In it, Norman laid the ground to modern UX by setting a list of ground rules based on his research in cognitive psychology. All these rules are meant to make sure the usability of an interface is optimal. And since only one of us here has actually a PhD in psychology, it's not me, Edin will take it from here and give you a quick insight into the main pillars of Norman's theory.
So, hi everybody, and thanks, Samir, for that brilliant intro. No pressure at all. So, in his book, Don Norman listed 6 main design principles, which are all meant to achieve the same goal, making everything as intuitive as possible for the user so they won't need to think too much. Or, in other words, they're trying to reduce their cognitive load, making the interface more usable for them. So, let's take a quick look at them. The first principle is visibility. And this is the idea that by making a feature clearly visible, a user will be more likely to see it and therefore use it. And this seems really obvious, but actually in practice, it's not always so clear cut. So we're going to have a look at it of an example from YouTube. So in 2014, this was what the YouTube app looked like. There was this menu icon on the top left, which we call a hamburger, and hidden behind it were the navigation options, home, subscription, and account. But the problem is these options weren't visible to the user. You actually had to tap on the menu icon to reveal the options. And because of this, many users didn't even realize they could subscribe to a channel that they liked. So YouTube quickly realized they had a problem with the visibility of their menu items. So this led to a complete redesign of the menu. Just a year later in 2015, the hamburger was replaced with a tab menu. Now all the menu items were clearly visible to the user, and more users started using subscriptions. Now, this isn't an easy decision for YouTube to make because a phone screen, as you know, is quite small. And this larger menu took up space that would be used for content normally. So there's always a real trade off. What's the most important thing for the user to see? And then that thing should be the most visible. In this case, the people at YouTube decided that increasing engagement was going to be their main goal. And they would achieve this by increasing subscriptions, which indeed increased after the option became more visible to the user. So basically, the thing is, if they can see it, they'll use it. So on to the second principle. Users also need to know when they've taken an action and what they've accomplished. This helps in reassuring the user and providing them with clarity. What was the result of what they've just done? And this isn't just about getting something like a notification to say your payment has been accepted, but it also includes things like micro feedback, like when you want to enter text into a field. So this seems like a really simple and casual task. But when you actually break it down, you begin to realize that there's a whole process going on here. So first, as you can see, the user hovers with the mouse over the text field, an action which generates 2 elements of feedback. First, the text box darkens and the cursor shape changes from an arrow to a hand. So the interface is telling the user, you can now interact with this text field. Once the user understands that, they can click on the box and the dialogue between the user and the interface continues. The box becomes highlighted, letting the user know now that the field is active, and the cursor starts to flash, letting them know you can go ahead and start typing. So once you've entered the text, you need to know what the outcome has been. And in this case, if something were to go wrong, they'd be shown an error state. As you can see here, For each step of inputting text into a field, the user is given some sort of feedback, and they know what the result of every action they take is. And ultimately, this gives your user confidence. Moving on to constraints then. Constraints limit the options available to users. And although this might sound like something that you wouldn't want to do, it's a negative thing, it's actually a positive thing, because what you're doing is simplifying a complex task for the user. So you're leaving out any of the irrelevant options and you're enabling them to focus on what they need to do at that specific moment in time. So for example, when you're entering numeric information, so when you're putting in a phone number or a credit card number, it really only makes sense to show the user the numeric keyboard, because you want to eliminate the possibility of them accidentally typing in letters. So mapping then is how you indicate what effect the control will have. So Don Norman's classic example of mapping is one that you're going to all be really, really familiar with. So we all know this. You go to the cooker and you're determined to switch on the correct ring this time. You carefully study which switch matches the ring you want to turn. And then, yet again, you somehow end up turning on the wrong one. And this is all down to the poor mapping of the controls. In digital UX, a good example of clear mapping is the volume control. And you can see it's really obvious, thanks to the icons and the width of the line. You can easily tell that the slider will increase the volume when you slide it to the right, and it will decrease the volume when you slide it to the left. So on to the next principle, which is consistency. And this is ensuring that elements with similar functions also share a similar design. This means that your user can then easily recognize them each time they come across them. They already know how they work, and this will require less effort on the part of your user to operate them. So a nice example of consistency is the red, yellow, green system. And whenever we run into this color combination, everybody knows what each color means. And a consistency like this that spans across multiple interfaces is called a convention. And when you break a convention, it can be a really jarring experience for the user. And unfortunately, I had first-hand experience of this. So every time I make a payment to my internet provider, I get this message here. Now, this is actually a success message to say that the payment has been successful. And what I would expect to see here is some sort of like a green box, but actually they're using this kind of purple pinkish color. And it's quite similar to what you would see in an error message. So every time I see this, I have like a mini heart attack thinking that the payment has failed. And then I have to read the text and then I calm right back down again. The last principle, and one of the most important ones, is affordance. These are the properties of an object that help us understand how we interact with it. And this brings us to another of Norman's classic examples. Sorry, the mouse. So this is doors, or more specifically, door handles. So again, we've all had this experience. We walk up to a door and we go to pull it, and it turns out that actually, no, it's a push door. So chances are it's not your fault. And next time you can just blame poor affordance. And this is because push doors should have a plate to indicate that you're going to push it with your hand, while pull doors should have a handle indicating that you're going to grab the handle and pull it. But in reality, as you well know, many doors don't follow these rules. And as you can see here, if the affordance was adequate, you simply wouldn't need a sign to explain it as well. So then, just like a joke that doesn't need an explanation, if the user can't figure out how to interact with your user interface to complete a task, you've probably violated Don Norman's principles of design.
Thanks, Aideen. So as we can see, Norman's work in the late 80s essentially connected the theoretical academic aspects of UX into the practical world, and more specifically into the modern world of digital products and interfaces. A few years after publishing the book, Norman left the academia and went on to work at Apple, where he became the first person in history to have the words user experience in his title as a user experience architect. He later continued to found the Norman Nielsen Group, and nowadays he's mostly back in the academic world, but his huge effect on the entire concept of designing products is still with us and can be summed up in his own words. A product is a cohesive, integrated set of experiences. Think through all of the stages of a product or service, from initial intentions through final reflections, from first usage to help, service, and maintenance. Make them all work together seamlessly. Now, if some of you come from the field of marketing, you'd probably relate to this statement in particular, since it might remind you of an important concept from the marketing world, what we call the customer journey. As you can see in this diagram, a customer journey goes through various touch points. And as you can see, more and more of these touch points are becoming digital interfaces. This trend has already been with us for a while, and it grew even stronger just this last year when more and more companies, most notably in retail and healthcare industries, were forced by the pandemic to go through rapid digital transformation and take their entire business online. So in many cases, most of this journey, or even the entire thing, is completely digital. If you look at the different touch points, in many cases, even the store itself is now an online store. And what used to be word of mouth is probably actually social media. So in this situation, essentially turns customer experience and user experience into the same thing, which turns UX into a powerful business tool. And indeed, since the 90s, UX was adopted by the marketing and business world, which turned it from a theoretical discipline, scientific one, into a practical approach to designing and developing digital products. So if we go back to our initial question, the more practical and more modern way of defining UX is as an approach to designing products that we call user-centered design, or UCD, a term that was also coined by Don Norman. The idea of UCD is very simple. In order to successfully design a product, you need to study and understand its target audience, or the users. Otherwise, you're missing the entire point. So this approach looks at UX as a process, you can see here. It can be done in various ways in different companies for different products, but the core idea is the same for all. It has these 4 steps. You need to start with research, most notably user research. Then you go on to analyze the research findings. You continue to design the interface according to your research and findings and analysis. And finally, you put on your researcher hat again and conduct tests to check and validate your design to see what works and what doesn't. We'll try to briefly cover these 4 steps, and we'll focus mostly on the research part, which is the core of our work. So, Aideen, why do we need to research our users?
Well, the main reason we do research is because we're not designing for ourselves. We have to understand the users. And most important, if we want to design a product that will actually speak to the user and meet their needs, we need to first understand these needs or goals or motivations, and also the frustrations, or as we call them, pain points. If we don't do research, we end up just designing for ourselves, and we're going to fall into the trap of self-referential design. So if you take banking apps as an example, so this app here is using the terms debit and credit to signify money coming in and out of an account. But if the designers had done just a little more digging, they would have found out that 25% of the population are actually confused by these accounting terms, and they're not really sure what each of them mean. But if you look at the newer digital banks that we're becoming more familiar with, they've actually done their homework. So they're making sure that they use language that matches that of their users. So here they're using a clear plus and minus sign and putting extra emphasis on money coming in by using green. So these banks, as part of their preliminary research before designing the app, they would have conducted user surveys, and they would have found out about the language barrier that existed in banking. So surveys are just one of the many research methods we can use to study users. And you can see in this chart, This is what we call an attitudinal quantitative method. Attitudinal meaning what people say rather than what they do, which would be behavioral. And quantitative because surveys allow you to sample a lot of possible users and to actually get statistically valid results. So surveys and any other quantitative methods are a great tool for collecting this kind of black and white statistical data. But if we want a really deeper insight by understanding the why, in other words, really digging in and reaching the cause of the user's pain points, you're better off using a qualitative method. And the most common and efficient one is to conduct user interviews, allowing you to ask why your user feels or thinks a certain way. So here's a nice example that shows you how asking why paid off for Bumble, the dating app. So in user interviews they conducted, they found out that many women actually didn't really like using dating apps. And by delving deeper and asking why, they discovered that many women felt quite uncomfortable because of the amount of unwanted messages they were getting from men. So by understanding this pain point, Bumble was able to build a solution called the Make the First Move. So women would initiate the conversation, not men. So we can see that knowing not just what people felt, but also why, allowed them to substantially improve the experience of their product for women. So you can see that interviews are excellent for collecting qualitative data, but you can still use them as an opportunity to collect some quantitative information too. So for example, card sorting is a very common exercise that is done with interviewees during user interviews. It's a really useful and simple tool to use when you want to understand your user's mental model. And that is, by mental model, I mean how they organize information in their head. So imagine, for instance, you're given the task of creating an online store for a hardware shop, and you need to create a menu like the one you see here, categorizing where each product will be located. So you could try organizing the products into categories yourself, but then you're going to fall into the trap of self-referential design. So how do you go about figuring this out? Well, it's simple. You just get your users to do it for you by using card sorting. So using sticky notes, or just a spreadsheet if you really care about trees, you write down all the products. Then you ask shoppers to group them into categories and name the categories. Asking them to name the categories gives you this extra bonus of using terminology that they're going to be familiar with. So you don't want to end up with something like the debit credit problem that I talked about earlier. So you'll end up with something like this. And you can use this to arrange the different categories and subcategories in the menu of your online store. So that's card sorting. So all the research methods I've talked about so far are aimed at learning about different aspects of your user. But maybe one that offers the most holistic understanding is the field study, which is a behavioral and qualitative method. And as sad as this might sound, having the opportunity to actually observe and question people as they use a product is a UK or a UX designer's ultimate dream. The designers at Heinz got to fulfill this dream. When they were sent off to watch families using Heinz around the dinner table. And they noticed that whenever a child asked for sauce, the parents would pour it. And this makes sense. We all remember how difficult it was to get sauce out of a glass bottle without it going all over the place. And while today this would seem like a mundane finding, back in the 90s, when this field study was done, this was a massive revelation for Heinz, because their research also revealed that if kids serve themselves, they would actually use 60% more sauce than their parents would give them. So the problem was Heinz's biggest consumer didn't have access to the product. So this is where the squeezy bottle was born. And this allowed kids to serve themselves. And Heinz immediately saw a 12% increase in sales. So as you can see, just by watching your users in their natural environment, you learn so much more about them. And this can help you make discoveries which massively impact the design. So I'm going to hand you back to Amir, who's absolutely dying to share his experience of user research.
Well, I guess so. So yes, if you think a family dinner is an entertaining way to conduct research, take a look at this. That's actually me in the corner there. And some more photos I took while conducting a field study and interviewing users a few years back in rural India. My client at the time was an irrigation equipment manufacturer, and the project was designing a mobile app that was intended for the Indian market and that would automate these farmers' irrigation systems. This is where I learned the true meaning of the term pain point while interviewing this farmer over here, a future user of the app, and learning that his main problem is having to go outside and turn on the irrigation system at night after dark. So I asked, why do you do it at night? And he replied, because there are electricity rations in the agriculture sector in India. And in parts of the week, we only get electricity at night. So I asked, okay, but what's the big problem? Why are you so reluctant to go out after dark? The valve is literally right there outside your door. And he replied, well, in this area, if you go outside after dark, you're at great risk of being attacked by a leopard. True story. And besides being a nice anecdote, the leopard story also ratified our initial business assumption that what these farmers need more than most is some way to control their irrigation remotely. But actually, the most helpful finding of this interview was the electricity part, which led us to add a whole feature to the app, syncing your irrigation activity with your weekly electricity schedule. So back to our process. User research is the starting point, indeed. And I'll just quickly add that it's not the only research you do. If you're designing a product in an existing market, you should also do some market research, study the competing products, see in what ways they've solved the design problem, what we can learn from them and what we can do better maybe, and see how they analyze the users. This type of competitors benchmark study also helps us understand what are the conventions that are already in wide use in this field, like specific terms or icons, which we usually like to keep. Besides that, your research should also include the stakeholders, the owners and the developers of the product you're working on, because as much as the users are important, you need to also adhere with the business strategy and comply with technological constraints. Once you have all that, you can continue to the next step and analyze your research findings. This part is highly theoretic, so I'll just kind of briefly go over a few of the techniques we used. So usually the first step of your analysis is defining who the users are by creating what we call personas. A user persona is an average or typical user, and each product can have a few of those. As you see in this example, a persona can hold a lot of information, but most notably, it sums up this typical user's goals or needs, and also the pain points and frustrations. Remember, we already talked about all those. And this is the core of the persona. This is something you'll always return to later on when you need to make design decisions. Now, I think this really shows why this exercise is so important, because the idea of giving your user a face and the whole character, that it really helps us to develop empathy towards these users, which is one of the most crucial aspects of UX. If you don't have empathy towards the users, if you can't really feel their pain, like the true fear of a leopard attack, you won't be able to create adequate products for them. This specific form of persona template is called what we call an empathy map, and it's arranged specifically to help us feel like we're in the user's shoes and make sure we know who we're working for. So once we've established that, we can go on to analyze what the users need to do with the interface. There are all kinds of methods to do this, depending on what type of product it is. One of the more common tools we use is what you see here. It's called user story mapping. I won't go into the details, just say that it helps us put order in all the different tasks each user persona needs to complete. So that's analysis. really like just in a nutshell. For the next step, we finally go into the design itself, which of course is an entire process on its own, has many shapes and forms. So I'll just stay on the very high level. So very roughly, you can say that designing an interface has four major elements to it. First comes the architecture, or a kind of a general blueprint of the entire interface as a diagram or a flow chart with all its screens and components and the ways they're connected. The architecture should be based on the user story mapping you've already done, and in many cases also card sorting exercises come in very handy here. And after you establish that, you go on to design each screen, which involves three additional parts, not necessarily in this specific order. The functional design or interaction design determines the content of the screen and the hierarchy and behavior of this content. The graphic design adds the shapes, the colors, the fonts, the icons, and anything visual. And somewhere along the way, you also need to remember to write the textual parts of the interface or the microcopy, which is something that's often neglected or left to the last moment. Now, this process can take many shapes or forms. Here's a visual example. You can see a design screen in three levels of fidelity. A low fidelity wireframe contains only functional design. It usually comes with written specs that explain the behavior of each part. What happens when you tap here, what happens when you tap there, so on. When you add the layer of graphic UI design, the wireframe turns into a mockup, which is more similar to what the screen will actually look like. And you can also add another layer of live interactions, which turns your wireframe or mockup into a prototype that you can test with actual users. Now, until recently, this process was pretty linear, and each screen would go to the same steps from wireframe to mockup to prototype. In the last 2 years, with the evolution of design techniques and design software, this process was pretty much disrupted. And nowadays, we actually rarely design each screen separately, especially in a large or complicated interface. We would normally or usually work with what we call a design system. For example, this one on the left is taken from Google's material design system, and the one on the right is taken from Spotify's design system. Design system is essentially design on the atomic level. It serves as a style guide or a bank of UI components, such as buttons, icons, fields, menus, pop-up windows, and so on. Each of them designed separately once, and then once it's designed, they're available to be used again and again, like Lego blocks to build your screens. So design systems really revolutionized in the last 5 years or so the way we design interfaces, made it a lot quicker and easier. And design systems are also great at helping us maintaining consistency throughout the interface. And as you can remember, consistency is one of the main principles of a user-friendly interface. And finally, once we've finished our design, we can test it. The last step, we can test it either as a prototype, or we can go on straight to development and test the product itself in live conditions. Either way, it's essentially more research work, except this time your research revolves around the interface you've just designed. Most common method of evaluating an interface is to conduct usability tests. In these sessions, we ask users to complete tasks with the product and see where they get stuck. We record them, we can interview them. On the right, you see an advanced version of that includes an eye tracking device, which this thing here follows the pupil movement and tells you exactly where on the screen the user is looking at each step. So you get an even clearer idea of what's going through their head. And if you think that's creepy, well, there's actually even creepier stuff. Like a few years ago, I saw a demo of a test kit that besides an eye tracking device, also had electrodes that connected to a user's head. They track their brain activity and presumably can tell you what sentiment the user is feeling at each step, like satisfaction, distress, so on. So usability tests cover the micro level of validation, but as part of validating your interface, you also need to take a look at the bigger picture and see if, besides being usable, the product is also useful. Is it solving the problem we were trying to solve? Does the solution meet the product strategy and the business needs, and so on? What you find in your validation process can serve as research findings for the next cycle of product design. We're going to start everything all over again, and so on, in a constant attempt to improve the experience of the product's users. Now, one thing you have to say about this process is that it can be long. For a complex product, an entire UX process can take months and even years. And that doesn't always sit well with today's world, where most companies apply some version of agile methodology of product development, which means they're working in short circuits and releasing a product bit after bit. In such an agile process, the big picture of UX can often get lost in the daily work of designing and redesigning pieces of an interface. So a solution that's become popular in recent years is what we call design sprints or design thinking. And promise that's our last buzzword for the day. So design sprints are these intensive ideation workshops. I admit the image here is a bit outdated. All these people congregating without face masks. If this workshop was held today, it would have probably been on Zoom. But anyway, a design sprint can take from one day up to a week. And in it, all the stakeholders from all different departments involved in a product get together. And together they tackle a strategic design challenge, which means they essentially speed through most of this process. The research is usually done in advance and just presented at the beginning of the sprint. And then the team continues to go rapidly through steps 2, 3, and 4 on a very conceptual high level. They apply some of the analysis techniques, and they end up with one or a few low fidelity solutions. Can even be paper designs like you see here, but it's still enough to run some simple usability tests, even just with random people you grab from the hallway, which is what we call guerrilla tests. And eventually the results of this workshop will serve kind of as a compass or a guide for the design projects that will come. So these are design sprints, and facilitating and moderating these workshops is just one more thing UX designers had to learn to do in recent years. Which brings us back to our initial question. And the third answer is that besides being a scientific discipline and an approach to designing products, UX has also become a profession. Now, the boundaries of this profession are still pretty fluid, and even the name of the role changes from place to place. Some places it's still called UX architect, in others it's simply UX designer. Some places are now moving toward more general UX specialist. And as the field keeps evolving to newer grounds, new specializations are created all the time. So as this image implies, you need to be a true Renaissance person to be able to cover everything that we've just reviewed in terms of knowledge and skills. I guess we could list these 5 basic ones. First of all, UX specialists need to be researchers. They need to possess the necessary theoretical background and know how to work with many research, analysis, and testing techniques. They also need to be able to plan complex architecture and user flows, very similar to an architect or a system analyst. They must, of course, have strong soft skills because, as we said, without empathy, you won't get too far. And of course, visual design is a must because somebody needs to design the UI. The specific skill is also highlighted here because it's the hardest one to acquire, which makes visual design studying the starting point of many UX careers. And as mentioned before, writing is also very important because every interface has a great deal of human language in it, which becomes even more complicated if the product is global and the microcopy needs to be localized to many different languages. And those are just the core skills. Besides that, because of the importance of UX to a product success, a UX person should also at least have a good understanding of the environment surrounding the product's interface, like strategy and business needs. And they also have to be up to date with the technology used to build the product, which defines the boundaries of what you can design. So to get UX done on the highest level, you would probably need not one person, but rather a team of different specialists. which is what you would normally find in the larger technological companies. In places like Google, for example, they have a whole department for each one of those bullets here. And the level of specialization goes down to very specific roles. For example, in Google, they have people who work full-time only on recruiting the people that participate in user surveys, interviews, and usability tests. And there's a whole theory on how to do that. But of course, most businesses don't have Google's abilities. So on the other side of the spectrum, we have many cases where actually one person covers it all. Often called the UI UX designers, which are usually visual designers in their origin who have mastered other aspects of UX. But as the field of UX keeps evolving and expanding, these do-it-all unicorns are becoming harder and harder to find. And the ones that actually do master all aspects of UX are usually in management positions and are very highly paid. So in some of the more common cases, UX is done by a team of two people. One is the visual designer, the creative or artistic mind who designs the UI. And the other, the more, let's say, analytical side is the UX designer who takes care of all the rest, the research, the analysis, architecture, functional design, and testing. And this one's also usually the one leading the process. And this is maybe the most important aspect of the job. UX as a profession, I think by definition, means leadership. Because no matter if you're a researcher, a designer, or a writer, all of them, or maybe none of them, it doesn't matter. Your job as a UXer, first and foremost, is to act as an advocate for UX in the organization, to be the person who puts the user's needs on the table in a board meeting, and to keep everyone on that same state of mind, where any design decision that is made is dictated by the goals and the pain points of the users. Thank you, everyone.